Welcome back, everybody. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hello, Dale. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here.
Today, we are diving into one of the most misunderstood naval battles of the entire Pacific War, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, fought October 25th through 27th, 1942. And I want to start by telling you something that I think gets lost whenever people talk about this battle. On paper, the United States Navy lost. One fleet carrier sunk, another put out of action, a destroyer gone, over 80 aircraft down. The Japanese held the water. The Japanese held the air. By every traditional measure of a naval engagement, the rising sun won the day at Santa Cruz. And yet, Japan never won another carrier battle for the rest of the war. That's right. There is the story we're going to tell today. A tactical defeat that quietly contained the seeds of strategic American victory. A battle where the Japanese outfought the U.S. Navy on October 26, 1942, and somehow still walked away from a slow motion disaster. Stick with me, because this one is worth every minute. Now, before we can understand what happened out there north of the Santa Cruz Islands, we have to understand why it happened. And to do that, we have to go to Guadalcanal. Because Guadalcanal is the engine driving everything at Santa Cruz. The Guadalcanal campaign kicked off on August 7th, 1942, when American forces, primarily U.S. Marines, landed on Guadalcanal, Talagi, and nearby islands in the Solomons. They seized a half finished Japanese airstrip, renamed it Henderson Field after Marine aviator Lofton Henderson, who was killed at Midway, and immediately found themselves in a fight they could not walk away from. 2 months later, by mid October 1942, Imperial Japanese forces remained locked in a brutal struggle with American forces over the island and the surrounding seas. Neither side had been able to finish the other off, and the whole thing had turned into a grinding war of attrition that neither side could afford. Here's what the situation actually looked like for the Marines on the ground in October of 1942, because I want you to feel this before we go to sea. Men on Guadalcanal faced death in multiple forms, weakened by tropical disease and malnutrition just as easily as enemy fire. By the time the 1st Marine Division was relieved in December, over 8,000 men had contracted malaria alone, and tropical diseases disabled nearly 2/3 of the division. They were eating Japanese rice when they could get it. They were sleeping in the jungle while Japanese warships shelled them at night. And on the night of October 14th, just 12 days before Santa Cruz, things got significantly worse. Japanese battleships, Haruna and Kongo, came down the slot and for 83 straight minutes hurled 970 heavy naval shells into
Whoa.
Henderson Field. 2-ton shells collapsed coconut log dugouts and sucked the air from men's lungs. Those Marines woke up the next morning to a wrecked airfield, shattered aircraft, and the knowledge that the U.S. Navy could not protect them. And that matters for Santa Cruz because Henderson Field is the reason the carriers go to sea. Whoever controls that airfield controls the campaign. The Japanese knew it. The Americans knew it. And by late October, Japan had decided to go all in. In a rare example of strategic cooperation, the Japanese Army and Navy set aside their bitter institutional rivalry long enough to plan a serious, coordinated effort to end the Guadalcanal campaign once and for all. The Army would launch a massive ground offensive to physically capture Henderson Field. The Navy would position its carrier fleet nearby, wait for the airfield to fall, and then destroy whatever American naval forces showed up to respond. It was actually a sound plan. On paper, with both services pulling in the same direction for once, it should have worked. The ground offensives kicked off on October 23rd. General Harukichi Haikutak, commanding the Japanese 17th Army, was so certain of victory that he had already assigned his staff to begin preparing for the formal surrender ceremony of all American forces on Guadalcanal.
Wow.
He wanted it to be an event worth remembering. His troops attacked with tanks and infantry. The Marines held. He attacked again on October 24th. Sergeant Ralph Briggs positioned 3,000 yards in front of the American lines with 46 other Marines, telephoned the command post of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, to report thousands of Japanese troops moving through the jungle around them. And the man who answered the phone was Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller. The Marines held again. Poor communication, delays over rough terrain, and exhausted Japanese troops without heavy weapons turned what was supposed to be a decisive, coordinated assault into 3 days of poorly coordinated attacks that cost the Japanese several thousand men,
Wow.
while American losses numbered fewer than 100. But here's the thing. The Japanese Navy didn't know the ground offensive had failed. Not yet. Their carrier fleet was already at sea, already maneuvering, already looking for a fight. And so was ours. Because the Americans had a new man in charge, Admiral William Bull Halsey had just replaced Admiral Gormley as Commander South Pacific. Halsey was aggressive, confrontational, and immediately changed the tempo of American operations the moment he took the helm. When his staff briefed him on the situation, his response was essentially, find them and hit them. He pushed his 2 carrier task forces, built around USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, out to sea and into the hunt. 2 fleets, 4 carriers on the Japanese side, 2 on ours. Both sides maneuvering in the dark, both sides looking for first contact. And in less than 48 hours, the skies north of the Santa Cruz Islands would be filled with smoke, and one of the most intense carrier battles of the entire war would be underway.
This is set up to be quite the battle. I'm not familiar with this specific conflict, like this specific battle, but I do know that the Pacific campaign, from the perspective of the Americans, was very, very, very difficult, especially on the ground. The conditions you mentioned, the tropical islands, but also like elevation and poor supply chain, and it was brutal. And reading some of the accounts that they had to endure, that's where my mindset is coming from. It's just like, I know that this section of the war is extremely difficult, but I know that the Americans and the Allies push forward in spite of all those difficulties. And there are casualties, obviously, because of all these difficulties and because of the tenacity of the Japanese military. But to see them push through and succeed in spite of odds, in spite of environment, is commendable, and it's amazing. And so as you're describing how both sides are stacking up, 4 carriers against 2 carriers alone that's not great. But I'm sure there are other support ships. There's probably battleships, destroyers, cruisers, and I'm sure at this point Japan has the advantage. Like you said, on paper, they should win decisively. But to know that this is not quite a Pyrrhic victory, but close, it's just kind of the where the momentum shifts. And I know based on the dates that you mentioned at the beginning, this is just after the Battle of Midway, which we had discussed previously. And so this is the beginning of the decline of the effectiveness, the battle effectiveness of the Japanese. And so I'm curious to see how this unfolds because, again, I don't really know about this specific battle.
So we have two carrier fleets maneuvering towards each other in the waters north of the Santa Cruz Islands. And I want to stay right there on the surface of that tension for a moment, because understanding why those ships are out there and why both sides are willing to risk everything on a single carrier engagement requires us to go a little deeper into what was actually happening in the South Pacific in October 1942. Because this wasn't just a naval battle that happened in isolation. Santa Cruz was the naval dimension of a larger crisis, one that had been building since August, and one that by mid October had reached what you could genuinely call a breaking point. Let me give you a sense of where things stood on the American side heading into the last week of October. The Marines at Guadalcanal had been fighting continuously for over 2 months. They were sick, they were undersupplied, and they were getting shelled almost every single night by Japanese warships running down what they called the slot, the channel between the islands, to pound Henderson Field. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal had nicknamed the place Starvation Island. That gives you a sense of the conditions both sides were operating in. It wasn't just a military campaign out there. It was a survival contest in one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. And then there was the man responsible for all of it on the American side, Admiral Robert Gormley, Commander South Pacific, had been running the campaign since the beginning, and by October, Nimitz had seen enough. Through the first 10 weeks of the Guadalcanal fight, Nimitz had given Gormley the benefit of the doubt when he persistently argued the negative case for the South Pacific operations. By early October 1942, Nimitz was convinced that Gormley was a natural worrier. A fine naval officer, perhaps untouched in diplomatic skill, perhaps unmatched in diplomatic skill, but simply not the man to fight this battle. Nimitz also privately worried that his old friend of 40 years might be approaching some kind of mental breaking point. Something had to change. On October 18th, it did. Halsey was handed his relief orders when he landed at Noumea. His response was, quote, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me." That is a man who understood immediately what he was walking into.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite a quote.
But here's the thing about Halsey. That quote aside, he didn't hesitate. Not for a second. News of the change flashed and produced an immediate boost to morale with the beleaguered Marines, energizing his command. One intelligence officer later described the moment the word got out. Quote, "I'll never forget it. 1 minute we were too limp with malaria to crawl out of our foxholes. The next we were running around whooping like kids." That is what a change of command can do when the right man shows up at the right moment. Halsey made it immediately clear he was not going to withdraw the Marines. He not only intended to counter the Japanese efforts to dislodge them, he intended to secure the island. Above all else, he wanted to regain the initiative and take the fight to the Japanese. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and where some historians have pushed back on the Halsey legend a little bit. Because that aggressive instinct that electrified the Marines, it also drove a decision that some have called reckless. Less than 2 weeks after taking command, Halsey thrust his only two carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, into battle against four Japanese flat tops. At the most marked disparity of aircraft strengths in any of the 1942 carrier battles. He was outnumbered and he knew it. Whether that was bold or reckless is a debate we'll have to come back to when we talk about the legacy of the battle. But for now, just know that Halsey was not a man who was going to sit on his carriers while the Marines bled on the beach. So that's the American command picture. Now let's look at what the Japanese was building on their side, because the Japanese plan going into late October was actually impressive in its ambition, even if it fell apart in execution. Japan's problem throughout the Guadalcanal campaign had been the same problem from the start. They kept underestimating American resolve, and they kept committing forces piecemeal rather than hitting them hard with everything at once. By October, they were trying to fix that. In a rare example of a strategic cooperation, the Japanese Army and Navy set aside their bitter institutional rivalry long enough to plan a serious coordinated effort to end the Guadalcanal campaign. And I want to emphasize how unusual that was. Because throughout the Pacific War, the Japanese Army and Navy operated almost as rival organizations, barely sharing intelligence, frequently working at cross purposes. Getting them to align on a single operational plan was genuinely difficult. The plan itself was straightforward. The Army would mass its forces and drive on Henderson Field, capturing it by October 22nd. The moment the airfield fell, the Navy's carrier force positioned northeast of the Solomons would move in, fly aircraft directly into the captured airfield, and then hunt down and destroy whatever American naval forces responded. Clean, coordinated, and decisive. If it worked, the Guadalcanal campaign was over. Japan controlled the central Solomons. The supply line to Australia was threatened, and the entire Allied position in the South Pacific was in jeopardy. General Vandegrift had reported in person to Admiral Halsey aboard the flagship in Numa Harbor and told him plainly he could hold Guadalcanal if he was given stronger support. Halsey promised him every available asset. Both men understood that if Henderson Field fell, there was no recovery. The carriers had to go to sea. The carriers had to be ready to fight. And that is the pressure cooker that produces the Battle of Santa Cruz. Not a fight that either side necessarily wanted on those exact terms on that exact day, but a fight that the strategic situation made almost inevitable. Henderson Field was the hinge point of the entire Pacific campaign in the fall of 1942, and both navies knew it. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the seas around it, and whoever controlled the seas around it controlled the campaign.
You know, one of the things that's always interested me was that rivalry that you mentioned, the conflict between the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy, and they would undercut each other at times. It was a very bitter rivalry. I think, and this is very difficult for me to come at it as an outsider and really understand, I think it was to not only prove that they were superior to the other, but the thinking was competition kind of bred excellence. And so if I stymie you and you succeed, well then, okay, I guess you were worthy of doing so. But if you failed, well then that's on you. Like, I have no problem giving you obstacles because if you're good enough, you're going to surpass them. But to think that if the Japanese military as a whole was coordinated, and again, we see this often with the American side on the past several episodes that we've recorded, there is a very good coordination between different aspects of the American military such that we're able to either do the best that we could in a losing situation or actually pull out a victory when it did not seem possible. And so those are elements that I think the Japanese were missing. They had so many advantages, and their fighting spirit was unmatched. But the fact that they were stymied by their own side in a way was had to have negatively affected so many different battles, and I think we're seeing that here. Or I guess not quite here because they are coordinating for the first time. But we would see it at Midway, we would see it at Java, we would see it. It's unfortunate, I mean, from the perspective of the Japanese, but fortunate for us. And I cannot imagine, I guess, on a separate note, the audacity of Halsey when you're talking about going up against a numerically and firepower superior force with what you've got, because you're like, we're going to take it to them. We're going to push the advantage, and we're going to protect our guys with everything we've got. And I'm stunned. And so let's see how it unfolds.
All right, so we've established the strategic situation. Henderson Field is the prize. Halsey, the new sheriff in town. Japan's combined Army-Navy offensive is rolling, and both carrier fleets are pushing towards each other across open ocean. Now it's time to actually look at who showed up to this fight, because the raw numbers tell you a lot about what both sides were walking into on the morning of October 26th. And I want to start on the Japanese side because, frankly, they are the ones who came to this battle with the bigger hand. The Japanese naval force at Santa Cruz was organized into three distinct groups, all operating under the command of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. Think of it as a triangle built for layered, flexible combat. Out front, running around 70 miles south of the carriers and positioned to absorb and deflect any incoming American surface threat, was Rear Admiral Hiroki Abe's Vanguard Force. 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 7 destroyers. That's not a scouting force. That's a wall. Behind Abe, roughly in the center of the formation, was the heart of the whole operation. Vice Admiral Nagumo's main body, otherwise known as the Kido Butai, Japan's premier carrier strike force. Nagumo's first carrier division consisted of the fleet carriers Sokaku and Zuikaku, and the light carrier Zuiho, escorted by a heavy cruiser and 8 destroyers. Shukaku and Zuikaku were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sister ships of the Shokaku-class fast, modern, purpose-built fleet carriers. These were not conversions or compromises. They were among the best carrier designs afloat in 1942, and Nagamu's flagship was Shokaku herself. Then another 100 miles or so to the northwest was Kondo's own advanced force, built around the 4th carrier, Janyo, Carrier Division 2, under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta. Included Janyo, escorted by battleships, heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. Janyo was a different kind of ship from Shokaku and Zuikaku. She had started life as a passenger liner before being converted into a carrier. She was slower and carried fewer aircraft, but she was still a capable platform with an experienced air crew. And she would play a surprisingly significant role before the day was over. Now, here's a number you need to keep in your head for the rest of this episode. Altogether, the 4 Japanese carriers embarked approximately 200 operational aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. 200. Write that down. On the American side, the picture is considerably leaner. Halsey had organized his forces into 2 task groups operating under the combined designation Task Force 61, with overall tactical command going to Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid. Task Force 16, directly under Kincaid, was built around USS Enterprise, the Big E CV 6, under Captain Osborne Hardison. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral George Murray, centered on USS Hornet CV 8, under Captain Charles Mason. The two task groups operated roughly 10 miles apart, close enough to support each other's combat air patrol, but separated enough that a single Japanese strike couldn't find both carriers simultaneously. At least, that was the theory. Enterprise and Hornet together carried approximately 140 operational aircraft between them. So already you're looking at about a 60 aircraft deficit against the Japanese before the first plane even leaves the deck. And then there's more to it than just the raw count, because the composition of the American air groups in October 1942 was still working through some serious growing pains. Fighter direction, strike coordination, and the integration of different squadron types were all things the US Navy was still learning at this point in the war. The Japanese, by contrast, has been doing this since Pearl Harbor. Now, the Americans did have one significant surface asset that's worth calling out specifically: the battleship USS South Dakota, sailing with Task Force 16 as part of Enterprise's screen. South Dakota was a brand new ship, one of the most powerful battleships in the United States Navy, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. She wasn't there to fight a surface battle. She was there to throw up a wall of flak around Enterprise and keep Japanese aircraft from reaching the carrier. And, as we'll see when we get to the fighting, she would earn her pay that day in a very dramatic fashion. When Enterprise and South Dakota arrived from Pearl Harbor on October 24th, they effectively doubled the firepower of the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific theater. But the odds were still roughly 2-1 against the Americans. Halsey knew that. Kincaid knew that. And yet they were there, pushing northwest towards a Japanese fleet that outnumbered them in carriers, aircraft, and surface tonnage. As one historian put it, that was not a bad set of odds by 1942 Pacific standards, which tells you something about just how rough those early months of the war actually were. Now, I want to take a moment before we leave the order of battle to talk about the commanders personally. Because the men driving these decisions matter enormously at Santa Cruz. And the contrast between the two sides at the command level is striking. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Nagamu is a complicated figure. He had commanded the Kido Butai since the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had been at Coral Sea, at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons. By October 1942, he had seen more carrier combat than almost any man alive. But Midway had done something to Nagumo. The loss of 4 carriers in a single day, the near total destruction of the force he had built and commanded, had rattled his confidence in ways that weren't always visible, but absolutely affected his decision-making. After Santa Cruz, Admiral Nagumo himself assessed the battle with unusual candor, writing that despite the tactical win, Japan could not afford to trade losses at that rate against American industrial capacity, and he was relieved of command shortly after. That's a man who understood, perhaps better than his superiors, what was really happening. On the American side, Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid was steady, professional, and capable, but he was also working with incomplete information about Japanese dispositions, and doing it under enormous pressure from Halsey to be aggressive. For much of the preceding weeks, Hornet had been the only operational American carrier in the entire South Pacific, responsible for providing air cover across the Solomon Islands until Enterprise finally joined her on October 24th. 2 days. The two carriers had been operating together for exactly 2 days before the battle began. 200 Japanese aircraft against 140 American, 4 carriers against 2, 3 Japanese formations in a coordinated triangle against 2 American task groups still getting acquainted. This is the hand that Kincaid was dealt when the sun came up on October 25th.
I think it's really interesting to the Japanese response and perspective throughout all these battles has been interesting because a lot of it is they have momentum, and so as a result, they have confidence that comes with that. When they are defeated or whenever they suffer losses, that confidence doesn't diminish. And so what is prevented is the ability to adapt and learn. And I think there are exceptions. And I think you mentioned Nagumo specifically is like, whoa, we should reassess. We should really consider what we're doing and how we're attacking and learn how to do something different instead of just doing the same thing over and over. Even though that was successful, we're dealing with a different enemy now. And so even though they were taking over massive territory in the Far East, the Americans fight differently or have different resources. And like you said, specifically have an increased industrial capacity that even though they're sinking ships, the Japanese are sinking American ships, the Americans are able to replace them in a good amount of time. Now, I am very curious how the contribution of the South Dakota affects this battle, because having a brand new ship is fun and exciting. It's like a new toy, but at the same time, it is decked out with all the latest technology that the Americans have to offer. And I'm sure they learned quite a lot after Pearl Harbor. And so this is, roughly a year after? 2 years? 1 year, almost 1 year
Almost a year.
after Pearl Harbor. Sorry, I thought it was 1943 for a second. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. So the fact that the Japanese relieved probably their most experienced carrier commander, not great, and I'm sure it happened after this conflict. And the fact that America is also relieving commanders, but in a way to strategically enhance the battle. Like they're relieving people they've been fighting a losing battle for a long time, and that does a lot to your esprit de corps, your mental load. And to have an admiral that consistently goes into fights with the odds against them and is expected to pull out some kind of victory, that's brutal. And so to rotate leadership out like that makes sense. This is it's a conflict of more than just militaries, but cultures and mindsets. And I just find it very fascinating how they approach things like this. The Japanese have every right to think that they should dominate this battle. More aircraft, more ships. Finally, they have coordination with their army. It should be a slam dunk. Let's see what happens.
So we've got the forces laid out. 200 Japanese aircraft against 140 American. 4 carriers against 2. A 40% Japanese advantage in the air before a single shot is fired. And both fleets knew it. Or at least strongly suspected that the other one is out there, somewhere over the horizon. The question for October 25th is simple. Who finds who first? And what do you do about it? And the answer, as it turns out, on October 25th is a whole lot of near misses, frustrating geometry, and one genuinely costly American mistake that nobody was going to put in the congratulatory dispatch. Let me set the scene. On the morning of October 25th, Kincaid's Task Force 61 is sweeping north and west around the Santa Cruz Islands, exactly as Halsey ordered. The 2 carrier groups, Enterprise and Hornet, are moving in company about 10 miles apart, scanning the horizon and pushing reconnaissance flights out as far as they can reach. On the Japanese side, Nagumo's carriers, Abe's Vanguard Force, and Kondo's Advanced Force are all maneuvering north of the Solomons, waiting on news from the ground offensive on Guadalcanal. And on October 25th, that news is coming in. But it's wrong. Incorrectly believing that Japanese army troops had succeeded in capturing Henderson Field, Japanese warships set out from the Shortland Islands towards Guadalcanal that morning to support their ground forces on the island, a force including the light cruiser Yara, and several destroyers was steaming south to exploit what Tokyo thought was a decisive victory ashore. There was one problem. The Marines were still holding Henderson Field. The Japanese Army's reports back to the Navy had been wildly optimistic, to put it generously. And those Marines at Henderson, they weren't done fighting. Aircraft from Henderson Field attacked that Japanese convoy throughout the day of October 25th, ultimately sinking the light cruiser Yara with the help from B-17s flying out of Espiritu Santo and damaging the destroyer Akizuki. So the Japanese lost a cruiser partly because their own army told them a battle was won that hadn't been. That alone should tell you something about the communication problems plaguing the Japanese plan. Back out at sea, the cat and mouse game is fully underway. At 11:03, a U.S. PBY Catalina reconnaissance seaplane located the Japanese main body carriers. But the Japanese carriers were about 355 nautical miles from the U.S. force, just beyond the range of carrier aircraft. 355 miles. That is an agonizingly close and frustratingly far at the same time. In carrier warfare, range is everything. You can know exactly where the enemy is and still be completely unable to touch him. Kincaid was staring at a contact report that told him where Nagumo was, and he couldn't reach him. So he did what an aggressive commander does. He pushed his ships towards the Japanese at top speed and gambled. At 14:25, Kincaid launched a strike force of 23 aircraft, hoping to close enough of the gap that his planes could reach the Japanese carriers before dark. The problem? The Japanese knew they'd been spotted by American search aircraft, and they immediately turned north to open the range. Owing to strict radio silence, Kincaid was unable to recall his strike group once he received word that the Japanese had reversed course. The pilots were already gone, flying towards a target that was pulling away from them at 25 knots. Now, here's where it gets painful. The strike group's commander, eager to find the carriers and unwilling to turn back empty-handed, pushed beyond the distance that would allow his aircraft to return to Enterprise in daylight. When the attack group finally returned to Enterprise, it was dark, and 8 aircraft and 2 lives were lost. Not to Japanese guns, but to inexperience in night carrier landings. Added to 4 aircraft lost in a deck crash earlier that day, Enterprise was down 12 aircraft before the enemy had even been properly engaged. 12. Gone before the main event even started. In a battle where you're already outnumbered in the air, that is not the kind of deficit you can easily absorb. There is a lesson in there about the cost of aggression without information, a lesson the U.S. Navy was still learning in the fall of 1942. But Kincaid filed it away and kept moving. As night settled over the Solomon Sea on October 25th, both sides knew that dawn was going to bring a fight. Nagumo had his carriers shadowed throughout the night by PBY Catalinas, those big, slow, unglamorous flying boats that served as the eyes of the Pacific Fleet in 1942. From the constant shadowing of his carriers by PBY Catalinas, Nagumo suspected that an American task force was searching for him. Throughout the night of October 25th, the Japanese readied their attack groups for battle. On the flight decks of Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho, aircraft were spotted, fueled, armed, and positioned. The air crew was briefed. Strike leaders studied their target data. Everyone understood that first light meant first strikes, and first strikes in a carrier battle always almost decided the outcome. Kin- Kincaid understood the same thing. He was doing the math. He knew that Nagumo had more planes. He knew that whoever launched first had a significant advantage. Hitting the enemy deck packed with aircraft, aviation fuel lines running before the combat air patrol was fully established. So Kincaid kept the strike group spotted on Hornet's flight deck throughout the night, ready to launch the moment he had a good enough contact report to justify it. He was waiting for the Catalinas to give him a fix he could act on. At 0310 in the morning on October 26th, a radar-equipped PBY found the Japanese carriers and radioed their position. This was the moment Kincaid needed. And then something went wrong that still stings when you read about it 8 decades later. Other ships in Task Force 61 received the vital transmission and appeared to have assumed that Kincaid also received the signal and simply declined to act on it. But Enterprise failed to receive the contact report at all. A communications failure. The most important radio message of the night, carrying the exact position of the Japanese carrier force, did not reach the flagship. And so the pre-dawn launch, the strike that might have caught Nagumo's flight decks loaded and vulnerable, never happened. The opportunity slipped away in silence. By 0500 in the morning on October 26th, the two fleets had closed to within 200 miles of each other. Both sides launched search aircraft into the pre-dawn darkness. Both sides were on the knife's edge, waiting for the scouts to call in. In the early morning hours of October 26th, Halsey sent a dispatch from Noumea, consisting of exactly 3 words. Quote, attack. Repeat, attack. That was the order. That was the entire guidance from the man in charge of the South Pacific. 3 words. Kincaid didn't need more than that. The scouts found blood just before 0700. And from that moment on, October 26, 1942, belonged to the aircraft.
So while you were speaking about this, I looked up the battle, and I didn't realize the lopsided odds from a ship perspective. It is obscene to think that.
I described the odds.
Well, I did like the number of destroyers, for example. The U.S. had 14, the Japanese had 24. That's huge. And then they had 8 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers, and we had 3 of each. It's the most glaring one was 4 battleships to 1 battleship. That's a lot. And all of this is once the PBY discovers the Japanese formation, I'm sure they're like, oh, we can kind of see the ships that are involved because it is 3 in the morning, so they're not going to be able to get a precise look. But that is bordering on insane, frankly, to attack with those odds. But I think, like you said, the Battle of Midway affected both sides. Nagumo was more cautious, more aware of what the Americans could do. And the Americans knew that if they gave it their all and they pushed hard with what they had, they could inflict a lot of real damage. And again, it does become a battle of attrition at some point. And even if you go in and you lose almost everything, but you put a big hurt on the enemy, the long game is industrial capacity. Can we replace the guys? Can we replace the equipment? Can we replace the ships, the planes? America can, and the Japanese are more brittle in this category. And so we see I think that knowledge on the American side as they push forward. I cannot believe the communications breakdown to the Enterprise. This could have been such an overwhelming victory. Um, I did want to ask about radio silence. And so clearly the PBY radios the position to the ships. Why are the ships not talking to each other? Are they afraid the Japanese are going to intercept them and then like triangulate their position or something? Or what is the advantage there? Or why when they launch the planes and the Japanese are reacting with a retreat of sorts to extend the range, why can they not communicate with the planes? You know what I mean? Wouldn't it be better to have that information?
Well, first off, the PBY Catalina, if the Japanese detect their signals, so what? They're a moving target. They may be slow, but if they're a reconnaissance craft, that's their job. They're there to take that risk. Now, the carriers are not going to transmit because, yes, they can be triangulated and attacked. Same reason for not calling back the aircraft. They got to keep those carriers safe.
That
Those,
makes sense.
those, that attack wing leaving and then not finding anything and coming back is better. Just burn that fuel than let the Japanese know exactly where your task force is.
That makes a lot of sense. I think so many of these battles hinge on intelligence. So, like when you were saying the Japanese thought that their army had captured Henderson Field, that breakdown in intelligence was a disadvantage for them because they thought they were in a position that they were not. And so they were risking a lot more. Yeah, oh gosh, this is well, we are at the attack phase. I I cannot wait. Well, I don't know. You set it up at the beginning. We're going to get pretty hurt, but they will as well. And when I say we, I mean America because we're Americans, and when I say they, I mean the Japanese. Let's see what happens.
So, both fleets were closing through the pre-dawn darkness at roughly 20 knots, 200 miles apart, and Halsey's three-word order, attack, repeat, attack, was sitting on Kincaid's desk like a loaded weapon. Enterprise had launched her morning search group before sunrise. 16 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, fanning out in pairs across a wide search pattern to the north and west, each one carrying a 500-pound bomb strapped underneath. Not because the search pilots were expecting to start a fight by themselves, but because in carrier warfare in 1942, you never send a scout out unarmed. The ocean, the ocean had a way of presenting opportunities that didn't wait for permission. At 0617, the first contact came in. Two Enterprise scouts, not the ones who would make history, but the first ones, found Rear Admiral Abe's Vanguard force about 85 miles out. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a formidable surface group, but not the prize. The prize was the carriers, and everybody knew it. 20 minutes later, two more Enterprise Dauntless pilots hit exactly what they were looking for. Scouting 10 Commander Lieutenant James Lee and his wingman, Ensign William Johnson, found two large Japanese carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, 200 miles northwest of the American force. Lee got his contact report off, maneuvered to attack, and promptly got bounced by 8 Zeros from Nagumo's Combat Air Patrol. The Japanese fighters were alert, aggressive, and very much awake. Lee and Johnson fought their way clear, scratching 3 Zeros in the process, but couldn't press their attack. They'd done their job. The carriers were found. Now it was somebody else's turn. And here is where the story of October 26, 1942, takes one of its most remarkable turns. Because intercepting Lee's contact report on their radios were two other Enterprise scouts flying a different search sector entirely. Lieutenant Stockton Bernie Strong and Ensign Charles Irvine. Strong was one of the most aggressively capable aviators of his generation, and this was a man who had been in this exact situation before, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. He had passed up a shot at Japanese carriers to bring his contact report directly back to the Big E. He was not going to make that call a second time. Strong and Irvine were already 80 miles beyond their assigned search sector when they heard Lee's report. They made a decision that required exactly the kind of initiative that the U.S. Navy in 1942 was still learning to reward rather than punish. They cut their search short, turned towards the contact, and went hunting on their own authority. No one ordered them to do it. No one approved it in advance. They just went. The Zeros from Nagumo's Combat Air Patrol were busy chasing Lee and Johnston around the sky, and that gave Strong and Irvine an unexpected gift: a clear shot. Strong spotted Zuiho below them, steaming in company with the partly cloud-obscured Shokaku. He called it a big carrier. Both pilots split their diving flaps and rolled their dauntlesses into a steep 70-degree dive, tracking the target from astern as the flight deck expanded in their bomb sights. They held their dives, held them, and at roughly 1,500 feet, they released their 500-pounders and pulled hard. Both bombs hit. A 50-foot crater was torn open in Zuiho's flight deck aft, knocking the light carrier out of the battle just as it was beginning. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots making a solo judgment call 80 miles outside their assigned area. 1 Japanese carrier mission killed both the main strike had even launched. And then, because the story gets better, Strong and Irvine were pursued for miles by furious Zero pilots, and their rear gunners shot down a pursuing Zero during the running flight. Both pilots made it back to Enterprise on the last of their fuel, finishing one of the finest individual missions ever flown from an aircraft carrier. Now, here's the brutal irony of that attack, and it matters a lot. Zuiho was out of the fight, but her aircraft were already gone. Her strike group had launched before Strong and Irvine arrived. The light carrier's contribution to the morning's destruction was already airborne and heading south towards Kincaid's fleet. Knocking out Zuiho's flight deck hurt Japan's ability to sustain air operations through the day, but it did nothing to stop the wave that was already in the air. And the wave that was already in the air was substantial. Nagumo's first strike of 65 aircraft, Vals, Kates, and Zeros, launched at around 0818 and was already heading for the American carriers. In barely 40 minutes, the Kido Buntai had gotten its first punch off the deck. The Japanese were disciplined, integrated, and fast. This was a fleet that had been conducting carrier operations since Pearl Harbor, and it showed in the smoothness of the launch sequence. On the American side, it was somewhat more chaotic. Kincaid's carriers began launching their own strikes almost simultaneously, but the 2 air groups weren't coordinated the way Nagumo's were. The 2 American carriers launched a combined 71 aircraft in their first strikes, but they were out in separate groups on independent headings. They lacked the Kido Butai's institutional integration of a fleet that had been drilling these procedures together for years. Hornet launched first, 15 Dauntlesses, 6 Avengers, and 8 Wildcats under Lieutenant Commander William Gus Wildhelm. Enterprise followed with a smaller fighter-heavy strike. The deck sign an Enterprise crewman held up as the planes rolled past captured the situation perfectly. Proceed without Hornet. Every man flying out that morning was on his own. And as those opposing formations winged towards each other over the open Pacific, something remarkable happened. The Japanese strike heading south and the American strike heading north passed each other in the air. close enough that the pilots on both sides could see the other formation. Zeros from Zuiho peeled off from escort duty and dove on the Enterprise strike group from out of the sun, shooting down 4 Avengers and 4 Wildcats, while losing 3 of their own. The man leading the Enterprise torpedo squadron, Lieutenant Commander John Collette, took a hit in his cockpit, crawled out onto a burning wing at altitude, and was swept away into the airstream. He was never seen again. His radioman, Thomas Nelson, was the only survivor from that crew. 3 things were now happening simultaneously on the morning of October 26, 1942, and they were all about to reach their violent conclusions at roughly the same moment. The Japanese first wave was boring in on Hornet. The American strikes were pushing through towards Nagumo's carriers, and somewhere on the deck of Shokaku, a second Japanese wave was already being spotted for launch.
So this is tense, and I can feel it, and it's exciting. My mind keeps gravitating to Midway, though, and knowing that the Japanese had lost 4 carriers prior to this battle, and numerous aircraft and very experienced pilots. And so even though the odds are with the Japanese, they are short a ton of experience. And so when you think about the numbers of Avengers or Dauntlesses that are shot down by the Zeros, like even in that one situation that you described where the escort aircraft peeled off, shot down 4 of each, but then lost 3, I have to think that the more experienced Zero pilots that had been killed in the previous battle may not have lost any Zeros. Like this could be a very lopsided victory with the Japanese having the advantage. But every loss in each battle matters. And so every time a ship goes down or planes go down or crew is lost, that is not just an asset you don't have for the next battle, but experience that you've lost. And so you're left with people that have fewer flying hours or don't have the knowledge from the previous battle of, oh, this is how they operate, so I'm going to react this way. That's gone. And so as the Japanese are responding to this American threat, they do have that discipline. They do know how they should respond. But again, this is the same method of operation that they've done previously, and they're not truly adapting. That's not to say that what they have isn't excellent and would normally be very decisive and very complete. But unless you're willing to learn and adapt to the moves of your enemy, you will not be successful. And I think that's what's starting to unfold as we progress through the various battles from Midway, including this one, and on through the rest of the Pacific campaign. I'm astonished at how those 2 dive bombers were so effective. And when you said a 70-degree decline, you're accelerating to the ground. Gravity's already helping you fall, but you're going faster down toward the ground. And then at 1,500 feet, you pull up. That's got to be a ton of G's. I'm super impressed at what they did and how effective that was. I guess the order of attack, repeat, attack was taken to heart. And so, great job, fellas. Let's see what happens with the rest of the battle.
So by a little after 9 o'clock in the morning of October 26, 1942, the air over the Central Solomons is a complicated and extremely violent place. Strong and Irvine are fighting their way home from their 2-plane attack on Zuiho. The Enterprise and Hornet strike groups are pushing northwest through Zero intercepts and towards Nagumo's carriers. And coming from the opposite direction, bearing down hard on Task Force 17, is the first Japanese strike wave. 22 Valve dive bombers and 18 Kate torpedo planes with Zero escort. All of them led by the extremely competent Lieutenant Commander Murata of Shokaku. This is the group that Pearl Harbor helped build. This is as good as Japanese carrier aviation gets in 1942, and they have a fix on Hornet. Hornet's radar detected the incoming strike at about 0855, roughly 40 miles out. Combat Air Patrol Wildcats were vectored to intercept her, but communication problems and primitive fighter direction meant that most of the Japanese attackers reached their objective largely unopposed. Here's a detail that stings every time you read it. The veteran fighter direction officers from Enterprise, the man with the experience and skill to run an effective intercept, had been pulled off the ship when Halsey took over command at Umia. His replacement was good, but not yet seasoned in the chaos of actual combat. The American Combat Air Patrol was too low and too close to the carriers for effective interception, and the incoming strike wasn't identified on radar until it was only 45 miles away and already in attack formation. Captain Charles Mason on Hornets Bridge could see what was coming. At 10:08, Hornets loudspeakers blared, "Stand by for dive bombing attack." 4 minutes later, it began. The first two valves missed. Close, but misses. The third one didn't. A 551-pound semi-armor-piercing bomb struck dead center on Hornet's flight deck, nearly abreast the island's superstructure, penetrating 3 decks before exploding, instantly killing scores of men and igniting raging fires. Moments later, a second bomb struck, creating an 11-foot hole. Within another minute, a third bomb slammed in near the first impact point, punching deep below decks. 3 bombs in the span of about 60 seconds. But the bombs were only part of it. The Japanese strike commander's valves, already heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire on its attack run, deliberately guided his burning aircraft into Hornet's island structure, bouncing off the stack, crashing into the flight deck, detonating a bomb, and showering the signal bridge with burning aviation gasoline. When the Kate torpedo planes came in from both sides simultaneously, the classic anvil attack, 2 torpedoes tore 15 by 30-foot holes in Hornet's hull on the starboard side, flooding the aft fire room and forward engine room. Then 3 more bomb hits. Then a second plane crash, another valve burning and mortally damaged, deliberately crashing into Hornet's port side near the bow. In the space of roughly 15 minutes, Hornet absorbed 3 bomb hits, 2 torpedo hits, and 2 deliberate aircraft crashes. She lost power. She lost propulsion. She was dead in the water, burning in multiple places and listing. The destroyers Morris and Russell came alongside and trained their fire hoses directly onto the flight deck. Damage control parties fought through smoke and flame and the sound of men screaming. They were, by all accounts, extraordinarily brave. By 1000, the fires were under control. The engineering crew was trying to reignite the boilers. The heavy cruiser Northampton came up and began rigging a tow line. Hornet was out of the fight, but she was still afloat, and her crew was not done. Now, here's where the battle splits in 2 directions simultaneously. Because while Hornet is absorbing that punishment, Hornet's own strike group is finding Nagumo's carriers and doing something about it. Lieutenant Commander William Gust Wildhem led Hornet's first SBD strike towards the Japanese fleet. Shokaku's newly installed radar detected Wilhelm's group at 97 miles. Extraordinary performance for the period, giving the Japanese time to position their combat air patrol. The Zeros fell on Wilhelm's formation with everything they had, tearing through his Wildcat escort and isolating the dive bombers. They went after Wilhelm's plane specifically, the lead aircraft, the one calling out positions. 1-0 put a 20 millimeter round into Wilhelm's engine. Eyewitness SBD pilot Clay Fisher recalled watching it happen. Quote, big blue flames, and pretty soon we were flying through his oil smoke. Wilhelm kept his burning plane on course, broadcasting sighting reports the whole way until his engine finally quit. He spiraled down to a water landing, climbed into a rubber raft with his rear gunner, and sat there watching the rest of the battle play out from the ocean's surface. He and his gunner were rescued by a Catalina 2 days later. With Wilhelm down, command passed to Lieutenant James Moe Voice. Voice led the remaining 11 Dauntlesses against Shokaku, Nagumo's flagship. At 0927, he went in first, and 11 aircraft followed him down one by one. The Zeros pursuing them into their dives, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns hammering from every ship in the screen. They held their runs. They held them long, not releasing until 600 to 900 feet above the target, well below the altitude where accuracy could be excused. The bombs landed squarely. From her midships elevator to the stern, Shokaku's flight deck became a series of ragged, smoking craters. The hangar deck below was in ruins. All anti-aircraft batteries on the after section of the flight deck were destroyed. A large fire erupted that would take 5 hours to fully extinguish. The number of hits varied by source. Wilhelm, from his raft, claimed 6. Voice claimed 4. The Japanese logged somewhere between 3 and 6. But the effect was beyond dispute. The flight deck buckled. The elevators were destroyed, and flight operations became impossible. About 130 of her crew were killed. Shokaku could still make 31 knots, but she was out of the fight for the rest of the day, and as we'll find out later, for much longer than that. So by 1000, on the morning of October 26, here's the scoreboard. Zuiho is out of the action. Shokaku is out of the action. Hornet is dead in the water and burning. And every American strike group that went out that morning has now spent its ammunition. The problem for Kinkaid is that Japan still has 2 fully operational carriers, Zuikaku and Junyo, with aircraft to spare. And their second wave was already airborne and turning towards Enterprise.
This is nuts. When you said 600 feet above the target before they dropped their bombs, I was absolutely astonished. And I kept picturing, as you were describing it, one by one, they're following each other. So there's this line of planes like ants in the air going toward, I guess ants don't fly, but for whatever reason, I just picture them going in a line. So that's, picture ants with wings. There we go. That's nuts. And then the Zeros that are constantly circling after them and the anti-aircraft shooting right at them. I can see why this was not only a risky endeavor, but we lost quite a few lives. This was not for the weak-willed or timid. That is crazy. Not in the... I guess it's just beyond my comprehension. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you is the Hornet gets really messed up by, like in 3D, bombs from the sky and then torpedoes coming in and then aircraft. Is this the first time we're seeing kamikaze attacks in the Pacific campaign?
This is not official kamikaze attacks. This is going to be kamikaze attacks were established later in the war.
Okay.
This was just Japanese pilots making a decision to do this.
Okay. Like they're out of the fight, so I might as well do something else to contribute to the battle. I wanted to ask, we talked about the South Dakota and how it was armed to the teeth with anti-aircraft firepower. Why is it not close to the carriers? I would assume that it would want to be close to the capital ships, like a carrier.
She's with Enterprise, not Hornet. We haven't gotten to the Enterprise yet.
Okay. Well, then I can see why the Enterprise came back then. That makes sense. And yes, you did establish that they would be far enough away that if a Japanese strike hits one of them, it doesn't take out both of them. So militarily, that makes sense from a strategy standpoint. Golly, I've had adrenaline in the past for various things. Sometimes stupid decisions on my part, or I just have to react quickly, or something. But I don't think it's ever been at the level of an American dive bomber racing toward a Japanese carrier in the heat of battle with danger all around, and then making the decision to pull up later to make sure my bomb hits. That's amazing. It's flat out amazing. And I think it's those kind of individual decisions that help tilt conflicts in the favor of their side. Okay, I got to hear about the Enterprise.
So, by mid morning, Hornet is dead in the water and burning 6 miles away. And Enterprise is the last operational American carrier in the Pacific. Let that sit for just a moment. The last one. And the Japanese aren't done. Enterprise had bought herself a few precious minutes by slipping into a rain squall just as the first Japanese strike wave hit Hornet. The squall hid her from the attackers. A genuine stroke of luck in a morning that had dealt very few of those to the Americans. But the respite was short. Nagumo's second strike wave, 19 Valve dive bombers and 16 Kate torpedo planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku, launched at 0810 and 0840 that morning, had been tracking their way south the entire time Hornet was being hammered. And they found Enterprise emerging from her rain squall at almost exactly the wrong moment. At around 11:15, an Enterprise lookout reported valves directly overhead. The Combat Air Patrol was badly positioned, again, controlled by the same inexperienced flight direction officer who had struggled earlier. And the incoming strike was reported to the cap with a relative bearing from the carrier rather than a proper compass bearing, sending the Wildcats hunting in the wrong direction. By the time anyone sorted it out, the valves were already in their dives. What happened next is one of the most dramatic minutes in American naval history. 1,000 yards off Enterprise's starboard quarter, the 45,000-ton South Dakota held her position at 27 knots, matching the carrier's every evasive maneuver, and opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun she could bring to bear. The new 40mm Bofors guns, the same weapons that would become the backbone of American AA defense for the rest of the war, were hammering out rounds as fast as the crews could feed them. The older 5-inch guns were firing, the 20mm mounts were firing, and the noise was so intense that men on nearby ships later described it as a single, continuous roar rather than individual shots. One or two of the diving valves were literally blown apart by the sheer volume of fire before they could release their bombs. But there were too many of them, and they were too determined. Japanese carrier aviators in 1942 did not turn back. The first bomb punched through Enterprise's forward flight deck at 11:17 and re-emerged to explode just off the ship's bow, peppering the hull with 160 shrapnel holes between the waterline and the forecastle. One Dauntless on deck caught fire. Another was blown overboard, taking with it aviation machinist mate Presley, who was manning the guns in the rear seat. The second bomb hit near the forward elevator, jamming it in a partially raised position, a problem that would haunt Enterprise's flight operations for the rest of the day. Captain Hardinson was throwing the helm hard over on every dive, standing on the bridge holding his helmet while he stared straight up at the incoming aircraft. Sharp maneuvering by Hardison prevented any of the 9 torpedo runs from hitting Enterprise. The Kates found her impossible to corner. All 9 torpedoes missed. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening to the destroyer USS Smith. During the attack on Task Force 16, one Japanese Kate torpedo bomber, already damaged and probably dying, sought out one of the American force's smaller vessels. The Smith was a Mahan-class destroyer, about 1,500 tons, screening Enterprise on her port quarter. She had no realistic defense against what was coming. The Kate came in low and fast and crashed directly into Smith's forward superstructure, its torpedo detonating on impact. The forward part of the ship was immediately engulfed in smoke and flame from burning gasoline tanks. The bridge had to be abandoned. The forward deck house was on fire, making the area ahead of the number 1 stack completely untenable. This was a suicide attack. 2 years before Japan officially embraced kamikaze tactics as a doctrine. A burning, dying aircraft deliberately aimed at an American warship. The Smith's crew reacted with a kind of disciplined professionalism that doesn't make headlines the way carrier battles do, but wins wars in the aggregate. With 57 men killed or missing, her magazines flooded, and temporary loss of steering control from the bridge, Smith retained her position in the screen with every serviceable gun still firing. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, made a decision that still gets talked about. He steered the burning Smith directly into South Dakota's massive wake. The battleship's bow wave and churning wake washed over Smith's bow and doused the fires that her own damage control parties hadn't been able to reach. The President of the United States later awarded Smith the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation read, in part, quote, "Although a hostile torpedo plane crashed into her forecastle and exploded at the height of the battle, the Smith, with her forward topside abandoned and aflame, gallantly held to her screening position on an aircraft carrier and fought off attacking planes until the fire could be extinguished." And South Dakota, she kept fighting through all of it. When Junyo's third strike arrived from the northwest around 11:01, 29 aircraft that had been flying since Kondo's advanced force launched them earlier in the morning. South Dakota was still in action, still throwing up that wall of flak. By the end of the battle, South Dakota was credited with shooting down at least 27 Japanese aircraft, a remarkable figure for a single ship in a single engagement. During this third strike, a bomb hit the top of South Dakota's number 1 16-inch turret, and the anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan took a hit to her stern. But Enterprise herself survived the third wave with only a near miss, helped by unsettled weather that threw off the Japanese bomb runs. Now, zoom out for a moment and look at the full picture by noon on October 26th. Zuiho, out of action. Shokaku, out of action. 9 months of repair ahead of her. Enterprise damaged. Forward elevator jammed, but still flying. Hornet dead in the water 6 miles away, and Northampton struggling to rig a tow line. USS Porter lost to a freak torpedo accident. USS Smith burned to the waterline forward and still in the fight. And critically, every American strike group has now spent its ammunition. The U.S. Navy has thrown its punches. The Japanese still have Zuikaku and Jonyo with aircraft available, and Kondo's surface force is racing south. The battle has entered its final, brutal phase. And for the men fighting the fires on Hornet, it's about to get significantly worse.
You have a way of answering the questions that I ask so completely and precisely. I'm like, where's the South Dakota? Oh, it's there. And it's ready. That was amazing. I have to think the destroyer that was hit by the torpedo plane that collided into its, I guess is it the aft or the wherever it crashed, it had to have been running alongside a larger ship at some point and had the wake wash over the surface of the ship and be irritated. It's like, ugh, we can't go too close to that ship because then we get doused. That's frustrating. And that had to click. I mean, I don't, maybe it was just a stroke of genius on the part of the captain, but that is quick thinking and action. And solve the problem. Like that's something you see in the movies. That's doesn't seem like a real life thing, but I am blown away at this guy's ability to handle that under pressure while still fighting off a Japanese attack. Incredible. Whew. I didn't think about the prospect of when you said America's thrown its punches. Like, yeah, there's only a limited amount of ammunition and fuel, and getting resupplied is a process. Like there's a whole supply chain that has to get this stuff to the ships far away from home. And that has to be, you got to count the cost before you jump into something like this. And so I'm sure they have, and they have put a hurt on the Japanese, but it's not over, like you said. And even though they've performed so gallantly up until this point, there's still more hell coming at them. And so you mentioned at the top how pivotal this was and how it was technically a loss, but long term it impacted the Japanese more. I'm curious how this concludes because, like I said, it's individual decisions and significant actions that can turn the tide of war completely. And what seems like a loss now could be a long-term victory. And I would like to see how this wraps up.
I want to step back from the fleet level picture for a moment because what we've been describing, Hornet hit, Enterprise damaged, Shokaku bombed, Zuiho cratered, South Dakota throwing up a wall of fire. All of that can start to feel like a chess match between admirals. Numbers on a map, tonnage and vectors. And it wasn't that. Behind every data point in this battle was a human being strapped into a metal airplane, flying into anti-aircraft fire thick enough to walk on, making split-section decisions about whether to press an attack or pull away, many of them knowing full well they weren't coming home. This section is about those people. Let's start with the most important casualty on the Japanese side, because his death tells you everything about what Santa Cruz actually cost Japan. Lieutenant Commander Shuigahara Murata was 33 years old on October 26, 1942. He had been flying for the Imperial Japanese Navy for a decade. He commanded the torpedo bombers in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the man responsible for the coordinated assault on Battleship Row that crippled the Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941. He had also flown at the Indian Ocean raid that survived the loss of Akagi at Midway. He was not a theorist. He was one of the most experienced and lethal torpedo strike leaders in the world. By October 1942, he had personally been present at more of the defining moments of the Pacific War than almost anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm. On October 26, Murata led the first Japanese strike wave towards Hornet. 20 Kate torpedo bombers, 21 Vals, and 21 Zero escorts. He personally executed a torpedo run against Hornet in a well-coordinated attack that achieved 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits on the carrier in the span of minutes. The torpedo Murata released is believed to have been among the 2 that struck home. But during the attack, his B-5N Kate was hit by anti-aircraft fire from Hornet's screen and went down in flames. He was killed instantly. The man who led the torpedo attack on Pearl Harbor died leading the torpedo attack that killed Hornet. The Imperial Japanese Navy posthumously promoted him 2 ranks to captain and gave him a special individual citation. Among other notable casualties was his academy classmate, Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki, who led the second wave strike that damaged Enterprise. Seki was also killed. Two of Japan's finest strike leaders, classmates from the Naval Academy, dead on the same day. And they were far from alone. The final Japanese aircrew accounting at Santa Cruz was devastating. 148 aircrew killed, including 2 dive bomber group leaders, 3 torpedo squadron leaders, and 18 other section or flight leaders. 49% of all Japanese torpedo bomber crews involved in the battle were killed. 39% of the dive bomber crews, 20% of the fighter pilots. Read those numbers again. Nearly half of every torpedo bomber crew that launched on October 26th did not make it back to their carrier. These were not replaceable numbers pulled off a production line. These were men who had been training since the mid-1930s, who had accumulated thousands of hours of carrier flight time, who had fought from Pearl Harbor through Coral Sea and Midway and the Eastern Solomons, and now here. After the 4 major carrier battles of 1942, Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and now Santa Cruz, at least 409 of the 765 elite Japanese carrier aviators who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor were dead. More than half. Gone in 11 months. And Japan had no meaningful pipeline to replace them. Prior to the war, Japanese carrier pilots were carefully selected after undergoing years of training in specialized schools, which produce high-quality aircrew, but at low volume. The Japanese military never meaningfully expanded or restructured this training pipeline. You couldn't place a Murata in 6 months. You couldn't replace him in a year. The skills he carried, the judgment about when to release a torpedo in a coordinated anvil attack, the instinct for how to read a carrier's evasion pattern, the authority that holds a strike group together under zero intercept. These things took years to build and a second to destroy. One eyewitness account from Junyo captures the moment of the reckoning. Lieutenant Commander Masataki Okujima, Junyo's senior staff officer, described watching the carrier's first strike group return from the battle. Quote, "We searched the sky with apprehension. There were only a few planes in the air in comparison with the numbers launched several hours before. The planes lurched and staggered onto the deck. Every single fighter and bomber bullet-holed. As the pilots climbed wearily from their cramped cockpits, they were told of unbelievable opposition, of skies choked with anti-aircraft shell bursts and tracers. That is a man watching his air group come home in pieces and understanding in real time what it means for the months ahead." Now, let's talk about the American side, because the contrast is genuinely important. The U.S. lost 26 aircrew members killed in the entire battle. 26 against Japan's 148. That asymmetry is not an accident. American training pipelines were already producing replacement pilots faster than combat was consuming them. The U.S. Navy had learned hard lessons at Coral Sea and Midway about fighter direction, coordination between dive bombers and torpedo planes, and the brutal math of strike package composition. And while those lessons weren't fully absorbed yet at Santa Cruz, they were being implemented. The infrastructure to replace losses existed. The numbers existed. The industrial base to build the aircraft existed. And the individual American aircrews at Santa Cruz, it should be said, flew with extraordinary courage. Strong and Irvine, attacking Zuiho with 2 aircraft on their own initiative. Wilhelm, pressing his attack on Shokaku with a dead engine, broadcasting positions until he hit the water. Lieutenant Voss, taking over from a downed leader and putting 4,000-pound bombs on the biggest carrier in the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Colette, crawling out of a burning cockpit at altitude and being swept away into the airstream. The men on Smith, fighting their fires with a Japanese torpedo plane embedded in their bow. These were not automatons following orders. They were human beings making impossible decisions in violent, disorienting chaos. And what they did that day, both sides, deserve to be remembered as something more than fleet positioning on a tactical map. The final arithmetic of Santa Cruz in the air goes like this. Japan lost 99 aircraft to America's 81, but the aircrew losses weren't close. And in a war that was going to last years, a war that would determine carrier battles in 1943 and 1944, it is that asymmetry, not the tonnage, that determined what Santa Cruz actually meant.
One of my favorite parts about this podcast, if not my favorite part, I mean, I love history. I love military technology and strategy. All that is super interesting to me. But the lens that is used here to focus in on the individual combatant, like what does this battle mean to the pilots from the Enterprise or the commanders on the Junyo? Like what is going through their mind? What are they seeing from a victory versus loss analysis or loss of friendships? I mean, there's nothing bonds people more, I think, than a shared commitment to an endeavor and then being victorious in that. And so all the while you keep seeing Japanese attacks with these incredible pilots and these Mitsubishi Zeros and these numerous carriers, and they're bonding. Like, this is an incredible group that is just has remarkable momentum. And then likewise on the same side, you have Americans that are clawing to get a foothold and battle against what seems to be a juggernaut. And in both instances, these crews they're coming together over common cause, both in victory and defeat. And so when you see your buddy get swept away on the airstream, that does something to you. That fuels you, that haunts you. And as a commander, when you see over 100 pilots of yours go down in a conflict that you should have won handily, that haunts you. And I appreciate that this isn't just a numbers game when we talk about these stories. These are real people. These are real people fighting for something that matters to them. And you may disagree with the purpose or idea that they're fighting for, but I don't know. When you talk about it, it's my favorite part. And I love humanizing the whole conflict because it's when you see special effects in movies, oh man, that explosion was incredible. Did you see that? But when an explosion happens on your ship and takes out people that you've been serving with, that's not awesome. But you still have a job to do. You have to keep moving forward. And knowing that these guys they work so hard to put out fires that are seemingly out of control so they can keep fighting. That's awesome. And I'm sure we have several service members listening that understand the depth of what that truly means. So let me say thank you for that. And gosh, it really brings perspective. So thank you, Dale.
So, we've talked about the men who flew. Now we follow one of them home. Or rather, we follow what happens when there's no longer a home to fly back to. By mid-morning on October 26th, Hornet was dead in the water, listing 7 degrees to starboard, burning in multiple compartments, and being worked on by her damage control parties with the ferocity of men who knew exactly what the alternative looks like. The fires were coming under control. Engineers were in the bilges trying to relight boilers. Destroyers Morris and Russell were alongside, passing fire hoses across. And the heavy cruiser Northampton was maneuvering to pass a tow line. At 11:45, her escorting destroyers removed all wounded and non-essential crewmen, about 875 men. Some of the remaining crew then dragged a 2-inch towing cable out of Hornet's after elevator well and transferred it to Northampton by hand, because there was no power to board to run the winches. By hand. On a carrier that had just been bombed and torpedoed and crashed into twice. That is the level of effort being made to save this ship. The line held. Northampton began pulling Hornet along at 3 knots. Barely moving, but moving. And below decks, repair crews were on the verge of restoring power to Hornet's engines when another flight of Kate torpedo planes arrived at approximately 16:20 in the afternoon. 8 of them were either shot down or missed. The 9th planted a torpedo squarely in Hornet's starboard side, flooding the after engine room and destroying the repair work entirely. The list increased to 14 degrees. Northampton immediately cast off the tow and maneuvered clear. That torpedo was the end of any realistic hope for Hornet. Her list was increasing. Her engine rooms were flooded. She had no power, no propulsion, and a Japanese surface force was reported approaching from the north. After being informed that Japanese surface forces were approaching and that further towing efforts were futile, Vice Admiral Halsey ordered Hornet sunk and issued the abandoned ship order. Captain Charles Mason was the last man to leave his ship. He climbed over the side as the destroyers picked up the remaining crew, and then began one of the more remarkable episodes in this entire battle. A prolonged, almost surreal attempt to sink a carrier that simply refused to die. After dark on October 26th, the destroyers Mustin and Anderson returned to finish Hornet off before the approaching Japanese forces arrived. They fired 9 torpedoes into her port side. Most of them were American Mark 13 aerial torpedoes, and most of them failed to explode. This was a chronic, humiliating problem with American torpedoes throughout 1942, and it chose this particular moment to manifest itself in the most painful way imaginable. Then they fired 430 rounds of 5-inch ammunition into the burning hull. The attempt failed. The burning carrier refused to sink. She was on fire from stem to stern. She had absorbed 9 torpedoes and over 400 5-inch shells, and she was still there, wallowing in the shells. When the destroyer crews looked up and saw the first Japanese ships appearing on the horizon, with advancing Japanese naval forces only 20 minutes away, Mustin and Anderson abandoned the hulk of Hornet at 2040 and withdrew. They could not finish the job. They left her burning. The Japanese arrived at Hornet's location at 22:20 that night. There was a brief moment of confusion. A decoded Japanese signal had instructed the oncoming forces to capture and tow the derelict carrier, which was the last thing the Americans had expected or wanted. The Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo quickly assessed the situation and concluded that towing was not an option. Each destroyer fired 2 long lance torpedoes. All 4 hit. At 01:35 in the morning of October 27th, 1942, Hornet finally rolled over and sank. The bottom was more than 3 miles down. She took 140 of her sailors with her. Hornet had been in commission for exactly 1 year and 6 days. In that time, she had carried the Doolittle Raiders to within striking distance of Tokyo, fought at Midway, where her Torpedo Squadron 8 was almost completely annihilated, and provided the only carrier air cover in the South Pacific for weeks on end, when every other American flat top was sunk or under repair. She was the last U.S. fleet carrier ever sunk by enemy fire. No American fleet carrier has been lost to enemy action since. Meanwhile, Enterprise damaged, her forward elevator jammed, her flight deck overcrowded with aircraft from both task forces, was pulling away to the southeast. Between 11:39 and 13:22 in the afternoon, she recovered 57 of the 73 remaining American aircraft. The rest either ditched or were sent to Espiritu Santo. Kincaid had no more cards to play. With Hornet out of action and Enterprise damaged, there was no operational American carrier force left in the Pacific. The day after the battle, the Japanese possessed the only operational carrier force in the entire Pacific Ocean. They had won the water. They had won the air. On the raw tactical math of October 26, 1942, it wasn't close. And yet, Kondo's surface force turned north that night without pressing its advantage. The Japanese carriers withdrew towards Truk. Several night attacks by radar-equipped Catalinas on Jonyo and Tsuruzuki. Knowledge of the head start the American warships had in their retreat from the area, and a critical fuel situation apparently caused the Japanese to reconsider further pursuit. The decisive surface engagement that might have completed the rout of the American fleet never happened. Yamamoto, holding his giant surface fleet in reserve at Truk, throughout the entire battle, failed to order it south. And on Guadalcanal, Henderson Field was still in American hands. The Marine attack had held. The Japanese Army assault had broken on the same Marine lines that had held every previous attack. The reason the Japanese Navy came south in the first place, the reason these two carrier fleets fought each other at such terrible cost on October 26, that reason no longer existed. The land battle was over before the naval battle finished. Enterprise limped towards Noumea. Her crew worked through the night on that jammed elevator. Her radar officer had climbed her mast during the battle with a toolbox to make repairs while anti-aircraft guns fired below him. Halsey immediately set all hands to work in a race against time to repair the Enterprise, the only U.S. carrier left in the Pacific. They asked for a loan of a British carrier. They got their hands down and went to work. Because what came next, the November battles off Guadalcanal, was going to be even harder, and they were going to have to fight it with one battered carrier and whatever they could scrape together.
Wow, that is quite an outcome. I think, I wonder what would have been the situation had the land forces lost to the Japanese. Yes, the Japanese won, like you said, on paper, but the pipeline is pretty empty, or it's a very long one, and they wouldn't have proper replacements for some time. So they have to do everything they can to keep what they have. And the Americans are showing that that's going to be a difficult task. I admire the bravery of these sailors and these pilots and the Marines, and knowing that we're going to throw some punches, we're going to take some hits, and that's going to make it harder for us, but they are taking the initiative. Like, by doing so, they're setting the battle on their terms. And they're doing everything they can. And I think the resourcefulness of the American Navy is properly displayed in this vignette. Like this window of time, you see, hey, this is all we've got, but we're going to do this. And okay, now that we have counted the losses and counted what we have left, let's pull it together again and do this other thing. And you're going to consistently see initiative taken by the Americans in spite of the odds being against them up until toward the end. And that should be talked about. That should be remembered. There's a quote. What is it, from Truman? That says, "We are not descended from fearful men." And when I see this, and I know that that is part of the fabric of what Americans are, it fills me with a pride and also an inspiration to know that I can do that also. So let these stories remind you of sacrifice, but also help you understand what people can do under fire, like literally under fire, and still take care of the responsibilities because there are so many people that depend on them and depend on you.
So here's where we land. Enterprise is heading southeast at whatever speed she can manage. Her forward elevator jammed, her crew working around the clock on repairs. Hornet is on the bottom of the Pacific, 3 miles down, carrying 140 of her sailors with her. The Japanese combined fleet controls the sea north of Guadalcanal. Kondo's surface force is unscratched. Yamamoto's battleships never even got into the fight. And on the morning of October 27th, Navy Day in Japan, the Imperial Japanese Navy has the only operational carrier force in the entire Pacific Ocean. By any conventional measure, that is a victory. A clear, unambiguous tactical victory. And I want to be honest with you about that, because some tellings of Santa Cruz lean so hard into the strategic disaster for Japan, framing that they shortchanged what Japan actually accomplished on October 26th. They outfought the U.S. Navy that day. Their strike leaders were better coordinated. Their first wave hit harder and faster. Their surface forces chased Kinkaid's fleet from the field. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pursued Kinkaid's retiring fleet and forced it away from the battle zone. The day after the action, the Japanese had more aircraft remaining and were in physical possession of the seas. Those are facts. Japan won the battle of October 26, 1942. But here's the question that matters. Won it towards what end? The Japanese had hoped for and needed a larger, decisive victory. The naval battle was won just after the land battle was lost, and that meant the opportunity to exploit the victory had already passed before the last Japanese torpedo hit the water. Henderson Field was still in American hands. The marine perimeter was intact. Japanese Army General Hyakutaki's offensive had been ground to pieces by the same men who'd been surviving on Japanese rice and malaria. The reason the carriers went south, the reason Nagumo and Kondo risked their fleet and their irreplaceable air crews, that reason was gone. And then the Japanese made it worse by not fully exploiting even what they had won. Yamamoto's giant surface fleet, battleships, cruisers, the full power of the combined fleet, sat at truck throughout the entire battle and never moved south. Kondo had the only undamaged carrier force in the ocean, and he turned north. The decisive surface engagement that might have completed the rout of the American fleet simply never happened. Admiral Nagumo himself understood what the battle actually meant in the cold light of aftermath. He acknowledged that this battle was a tactical win, but a shattering strategic loss for Japan. Considering the great superiority of our enemy's industrial capacity, we must win every battle overwhelmingly in order to win this war. That is the commander who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, telling you in plain language that what just happened at Santa Cruz was not enough. And he was right. He was relieved of command shortly after and reassigned to shore duty. But his assessment was correct. Now, let's take a look at what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because the real verdict on Santa Cruz was not written on October 26th, but in November. Both Shokaku and Zuiho were forced to return to Japan for extensive repairs. Zuiho's repairs were completed in December, and she returned to Truk in January 1943. Shokaku was under repair until March 1943 and did not return to the front until July 1943. 9 months. The most powerful carrier in the Japanese fleet was out of the Pacific War for 9 months because of the bombs Voice's Dauntlesses put through her flight deck at Santa Cruz. And Zuikaku, undamaged, fully operational, was also sent back to Japan. Not because of battle damage, but because so many of her veteran air crews had been killed that she couldn't field a functioning air group without replacing pilots. And Japan had no quick way to replace them. That meant that when the decisive November battles arrived, the naval battle of Guadalcanal from November 12th to 15th, the engagement that finally broke Japanese naval power in the Solomons, Japan went in without its carriers. Not because they've been sunk, because they've been bled. Junyo was the only active Japanese carrier left to challenge Enterprise or Henderson Field for the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. One, against a country that was already building Excess-class fleet carriers in American shipyards at a rate Japan could not dream of matching. Enterprise, meanwhile, limped back to Noumea, and Halsey put every available engineer on her around the clock. For 11 days, she was completely incapacitated. Hull breaches were repaired, but the jammed forward elevator awaited dry docking in the United States. When she finally went to sea again, Pearl Harbor estimated she was operating at about 70% of her combat efficiency. 70%. And she still went back in. When the November fighting erupted around Guadalcanal, Enterprise's aircraft were operating out of Henderson Field, while the ship herself held station offshore. Her crew flying missions from an airstrip on the island their shipmates had helped keep in American hands. As she withdrew from the battle, someone on the crew posted a sign on her flight deck, quote, Enterprise versus Japan. That sign captures something real. There was a moment in late October and early November 1942 when the United States Navy was down to one damaged carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. That is how close it got. The margin was genuinely thin. But here's what Halsey understood that Yamamoto perhaps didn't fully reckon with. The United States could take that kind of loss and recover. A new Hornet, an Essex-class carrier, was commissioned just over a year later in November 1943. Between December of 1942 and the end of the war, 19 Essex-class carriers were commissioned. Japan could not hope to produce warships at such a rate. As one historian put it bluntly, quote, the Japanese Navy is different from the American Navy. If you lose one ship, it will take years to replace. The Americans lost Hornet at Santa Cruz. They replaced her and kept building. Japan lost Murata, Seki, and 148 air crews who had been forged across years of training and combat. They never replaced them. Halsey himself put it best. He wrote of Santa Cruz, quote, tactically, we picked up the dirty end of the stick, but strategically, we handed it back. That is about as concise a summary of this battle as anyone has ever managed. The Japanese outfought the Americans on October 26, 1942, and in doing so, they burned through what remained of the veteran naval air arm that had made them so formidable in the first place. After Santa Cruz, the Japanese carriers would never again play an offensive role in the Guadalcanal campaign, the last carrier battle of the Pacific War until the Battle of the Philippine Sea, nearly 2 years later, ended with a Japanese tactical victory that quietly guaranteed a Japanese strategic defeat. The Battle of Santa Cruz Island is not a comfortable story for either side. It is not a clean American triumph like Midway. It is not a clean Japanese triumph either. It's the story of two exhausted navies fighting each other to a bloody standstill at the absolute hinge point of the Pacific War. And the side that could afford the losses, winning not the battle, but the campaign. The Marines held Henderson Field. Enterprise went back in, and the Japanese carrier air arm, the force that had seemed unstoppable at Pearl Harbor and breathtaking at Midway, and never fully recovered. That's the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands.
What a story. Like what a conflict. I mean, just knowing how much was riding on each meeting between these two powers and how important intelligence is and how important the industrial capacity is, military training, adaptability. So many of these lessons keep coming up, specifically in the American versus Japanese theaters. It's easy to see that short-term losses are acceptable if long-term victory is assured. And I think America did a good job of putting the pieces together to make sure that they could produce ships and men that were capable to fight. And that also secured the resources to do so. I mean, I know Japan didn't have steel, really. They didn't have oil, and those are huge complications. America did. That makes the difference. And so if you don't have material, you don't have training, you cannot win.
All righty. Well, this is where we're going to end it, guys. We went long, but to properly tell these stories, I'm thinking that going long is better than not telling it properly. So, Christoph, get us out of here, man.
All right, definitely. Well, thank you so much. If you're listening to the end, we really appreciate it. If you have questions or comments about anything we've discussed, or maybe you've had a relative that was involved in this battle, let us know. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter with the handle @USNHistoryPod. N as in Navy, obviously. We also have a Discord server, so if you want to jump on there and talk to fellow listeners or even Dale and myself, you certainly can. You can find that in the show notes of whatever podcast provider you have. And finally, if you could rate this show, review it, that means a lot. That helps us get the word out to more people. And every episode we see more different places listening and just various groups of people in different places, and it blows my mind, frankly. So thank you for showing up, and thank you for finding this valuable, and I hope we can continue to do that for you.
Well, with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.